Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream Vision by podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. M. David Litwa, and today we're going to be discussing his book called Iesus Deus, the early Christian depiction of Jesus as a Mediterranean god. And I have a link to it in the description below, the Amazon link. I highly recommend this book. And let's get started. Well, welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Litwa. Been some time.
Yes, thanks so much, Jacob, and good job pronouncing the book. Yes, I was told by
Thank you.
my advisor, my PhD advisor, to put this Latin title on it. Iesus Deus just means Jesus the God.
Hmm. Let me get to the first question, which might be an obvious one. Um, what caused you to conclude that the early Christian depiction of Jesus should be placed in the category of the Mediterranean gods?
Well, it's just a way of being contextual, right? I mean, Jesus is born in the Mediterranean world. The Mediterranean world during his time was even more united than it was in our time. I mean, obviously, we have email and telecommunications today, but it was all basically one country from Spain to Syria in antiquity. And if we're going to understand how Jesus became a god, by which I mean historically, in the minds of real people, right? We have to understand him in his Mediterranean context because he's not the only dude or person become to be viewed as a deity in that time and context. So then the question was for me, and this is my dissertation, the question was for me, well, how would an ancient Mediterranean person come to that conclusion? Is it a rational conclusion? And would they use the same rational processes as someone today would use? Because, the way we learn about Jesus' divinity today is it's just like handed down to us as a creedal statement, and then you sort of believe it or you don't. But in Jesus' day, people actually had to figure this out for themselves. And not everyone agreed that Jesus was a god or became a god. So, what was the rationale of those who were pushing this and won out, so to speak, in their presentation? And in saying this, I'm not making any arguments about him becoming a Trinitarian God, because all of that is mostly fourth century. Uh, Jesus can become a god in various ways, by becoming a really powerful angel, or by becoming something more like a Greco-Roman god, or becoming something more like a deified man like Philo's Moses or Apollonius of Tyana, or what have you.
And what are your thoughts on Philo on the Son of God? How does that relate to this?
Well, Philo, the category of son of God isn't really a prominent theme in Philo, but Philo does on occasion refer to the Logos as a son of God, and then he refers to human beings as sons of the Logos. But what I really want to focus on with Philo, in which I have in a separate article in the Studio Philonica Annual called The Deification of Moses and Philo, is what are the ways, why was it that Philo thought Moses was a divine being? And was there any parallel to the way Christians thought that Jesus was a divine being? And I raise the question because Philo is so significant, because he's right there at the very moment talking about Moses' deification when Christians are just figuring out ways to talk about Jesus' deification. So if you want to understand how Jesus was deified, you learn exactly from the contemporaries, which would be Philo and Plutarch, these writers who are writing at exactly the same time as the birth of Christianity, as nascent Christianity is developing and taking off theologically. And Philo has this portrait. Yes, Moses was a Jewish lawgiver, but at the end of his life, or I should start at the beginning. At the beginning of his life, Moses was donated to the earth, loaned to the earth, literally, Philo says, because he was a soul that did not need to be incarnate. And this is a very rare type of soul. But he was a soul that didn't need to be incarnate, but came and incarnated himself in this world to educate human beings and to lead the nation of Israel, which is the nation of the God-seeing people, the people who can see God. And that is why Moses, didn't have any passions. He had no sexual drive. He was a very fast learner. He was wise as a boy and had all these traits that are normally associated with gods and divine persons. And it's why he could, see God in the burning bush when no one else couldn't. It's why he could part the Red Sea, because God donated power to Moses to perform miracles and to have control over the elements of nature, as Philo puts it. And then at the end of his life, Moses recapitulates his ascent to Sinai, which was, for Philo, it wasn't an ascent to a physical mountain on the Sinai Peninsula. It was an ascent to the intelligible world, in which Moses left his body, and much like Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, and entered into the invisible realm, which is known to no one. And it's in that realm that he received the laws, which are nothing but natural laws, that he wrote down, came back, and at the end of his life, that disengagement from his flesh became permanent. He was whirled away. His fleshly elements were whirled away, and all that he had left was his divine nous, or his mind, or consciousness, as I like to translate it. And this is the subject of Moses. This is the true Moses that rose to heaven, much like Heracles on a chariot. And his grave was never known, says Philo, because, in fact, he didn't really die.
Which one of the Mediterranean gods reminds you of Jesus the most?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, so I compare him with many different types of deities. I wouldn't say that there's just one that one can kind of settle on as a kind of archetype or paradigm. In chapter 5 of the book, I focus on 3 Heracles, Romulus, and Asclepius as gods who come back to life after being killed. But I also compare Jesus with Plato in chapter 1, who has a divine conception. And I bring in Dionysius in chapter 2 as a child god, and Hermes as a child god when I compared stories of Jesus the child in chapter 2. And so I wouldn't say you could just pick just one as a kind of paradigm, because that's really not how the mind works. I mean, we're very selective, and when you're in a certain culture, it's like we're influenced not just by Superman, Batman, and the Hulk. I mean, we're influenced by so many other depictions of powerful figures, and it's often the case that the brain kind of synthesizes and is in dynamic cultural interaction, as I like to say, with a whole sphere of gods and divine beings. And what Christians would do is, ancient Christians, maybe modern ones too, would deny that they actually received any information, from Hellenic stories and cults. But since this was their bread and butter, the stuff that they would have seen in theaters and artwork and sculpture and even just going to the local gymnasium, they would have seen all this all the time, everywhere. So the idea of a rough kind of generalized influence is what I'm aiming for, and that means that they would have known dozens, if not hundreds, of stories of Greco-Roman gods, which may or may not have influenced their understanding of how a human becomes a deity. And throw into that mix, the most famous Greco-Roman gods of all at the time were Roman emperors.
Is there any evidence of early Christian syncretism of early Mediterranean deities with Jesus, and or evidence of early Christians identifying Jesus with another deity?
Well, I'd like to throw out this term syncretism because it ends up that this is a kind of pejorative term. Like it kind of means like a pollution or a contamination, of sort of like a negative mixing. It has this sort of nasty edge, and again, I'd like to think more in terms of the category of either dynamic cultural interaction or simply cosmopolitan mentality. Um, Again, this has to do with simple cognitive science, right? So, and with sociology. It's how we are socialized and how the brain picks up things when being enculturated in a particular culture. So, if by syncretism you just mean that, in antiquity, ideas were in the air and people living in that world absorbed, adapted, and developed and mixed together and conflated different sorts of ideas and paradigms of knowledge. That's all that I would ever mean by this cosmopolitan mentality. They would deny, again, that they're borrowing from one specific source. I mean, if Dennis MacDonald had a time machine and went back, and asked, the writer of the Gospel of Mark, did you have Homer open when you were composing your your gospel? I mean, the author, I think, would completely deny it, and they would deny any, you know, unnecessary contact with so-called Hellenic, or as it's still called today, unfortunately, pagan culture. Because what they're trying to do is just like any subculture today, they're trying to create an authentic selfhood and identity for their own subculture. And that means they're trying to set boundaries between themselves and the majority culture, but they can't avoid being influenced by the majority culture. But it would be very rare in a weird circumstance where you could pinpoint and say, okay, you're definitely just borrowing from the myth of Heracles. I mean, I think that they did, but they also borrowed from anywhere and everywhere, sometimes even, subconsciously. And whenever they borrowed, they adapted. This is how you generate a distinct religious identity. You don't make up something ex nihilo. You take from other cultural spheres and other dominant cultural ideas, and then you create something new out of that. That's how the human brain works.
Can you tell us about Origen distinguishing miracles from magic?
Well, um, I mean, there is no distinction, right? From our modern, as I like to say, edict perspective. I mean, they're the same kinds of rituals, but miracle and magic are insider religious terms that are designed to create boundaries and identities, right? So, Jesus, to use an example, he goes up to an upper room where there's a dead girl, and he, kneels by the bed and he whispers into her ear, Ephthatha, or some other weird Semitic phrase that would have been completely, weird and foreign to the Greek readers of the New Testament. And all of a sudden, her eyes open and she comes back to life. And is this different than, reading in, say, the Greek magical papyri where, a magus is invited to somebody's house to raise their dead grandfather with a bunch of weird and spooky words. No one knows what he's saying, but I mean, it sort of sounds like, one of these old Catholic rites of exorcism. It's all this old Latin kind of stuff, which is ends up in like exorcist films now, where it's just like this weird, spooky language now. And it just sounds a lot like magic, and you're doing things with words. Well, both so called magicians and religious specialists did that. So, you know, in modern academic culture, we would just call them all religious specialists or practitioners using what is sometimes called magicae voces, or, secret foreign sounding words to generate some effect on reality, regardless of what that is. I mean, it could be as simple as making the girl next door fall in love with you. I mean, it's very, very practical stuff here. So what Origen tries to do is really what every Christian has to do. They have to say that, well, I mean, they have to defend their own tradition of Jesus's miracle working as miracles, and they have to say that anything non-Christian is magic. And there's various strategies of doing that. They like to create these categories to say that, well, the true religion and true miracles, happen by the grace of God. You ask God to do something. Whereas magic is where you're demanding a god, often a lower god, to do something. Well, I mean, is it a good distinction? I mean, it sounds good at first until you really see how this is practiced, you know. So, Jesus says to the young girl, I think something like "taluthi kum" or something like that, which is then translated in Mark's gospel as, "little girl, get up." Well, is that a kind request, or is that a demand? And who's it being addressed to? These are actually quite ambiguous questions. I mean, to me, it sounds like an out and out command. And is it addressed to a little girl, or is it addressed to God? I don't know. So if it's a demand rather than a request, does it qualify as magic? Here's where we get into the weeds, and where we kind of figure out that this distinction between magic and miracle is an artificial one. And as usual, Origen has other ways of making the distinction. He says that, well, magic is you're making contact with daimones, or modern demons, whereas in true miracle you're making contact with God. Well, does that really hold water? Because, and again, when you see Christian and Jewish magicians in operation, and we have magical spells from Christian texts. Ancient Christian Magic is a book edited by Marvin Meyer, and it's a list of Christian spells, translation of Christian spells in late antiquity. And you see that they're not all addressing God. They're often addressing angelic figures like Michael and other beings, saints, or whoever. So does that then count as magic because it's not addressed to God? It's addressed to the lower divine beings? I mean, again, this is the way that Origen and others would try to make the distinction. But then when you look at the actual practice, the distinction doesn't really hold water.
Paul Kickling, thank you for your super chat. Have you looked into the Caucasus pantheons? They have a blend of the Greeks and Persians. In fact, Amarana is said to where Prometheus comes from.
Well, in antiquity, the Romans did worship a Persian god. He was called Mithras, and Mithras is the mediator. I mean, Romans consider this to be a Persian deity, and he does show up in Persian literature. His Roman form, I would say, is not doesn't look too much like the Persian version, but I mean, there was definitely ancient persons were definitely aware of Persian style deities, and I've got an episode on the Patreon on the Magi as Persian priests, and so even Christian authors are very happy to have Persian or Zoroastrian priests stop by and visit the baby Jesus. And I don't know. I mean, they give gifts, right? But they also share their lore. And it was by their own lights, or by the lights of the sky, that these Persian theologians got to Jesus in the first place. So, yes, particularly on that eastern corridor of the Roman Empire, right around the Euphrates, you're going to have a huge amount of mixing of traditions, both Greek and Roman, and also Persian mythologies, we might say, but to them it was just their own religious lore.
When the New Testament was being composed, specifically when the Gospels were being written down, did the Gospel authors, whoever they were they being influenced by the worship of other Mediterranean deities when they were writing about Jesus?
Well, Jacob, I don't see how they could not be. I mean, it's sort of like, if you're living in America, are you influenced by McDonald's? I mean, or are you influenced by, I don't know, the news? I mean, of course. I mean, it's everywhere. Are you influenced by, the thousands of advertisements that barrage you on a daily basis from God knows who, Nike, and, you know, especially during Christmas time? And I forgot to say, this is Solstice Day, holiday of Sol Invictus, happy holidays. This is the time where the gods of Christmas come out in a rage and totally overwhelm us with advertisements. Those of you watching this on YouTube will probably have 3 or 4 advertisements breaking all this up. I mean, can we ever really stop being influenced by our world, by the ads that constantly rush at us? And a Greco-Roman ad is is all these Greco-Roman gods and stories that, again, you walk down the street of Ephesus, and you can do that today, still today, and you'd be bombarded by sculptures of different gods. You'd be bombarded by paintings. You'd be bombarded by people miming the gods. These Greco-Roman mimes. They would be performing on the streets. And then if you go to the theater, you'll see plays about the gods there, and gods coming in, uh, on a sidearm, acting as characters in the plays. If you'd go to your local gymnasium, you'll see that it's dedicated to Hermes and Heracles, because those are the gods of exercise, and Hermes is the god of merchandise. And yeah, and then you have to, there's state religions in all these cities, Greco-Roman cities. So you have to pass by 3 or 4 temples just, on your way to the market. And on festival times, you're almost compelled to participate, because you get, free sacrifice of meat. The local priests sacrifice to Apollo and are handing out slabs of meat. I mean, very few people are going to turn that down. I mean, how could you not be influenced by all of this going on all around you? And then, with the Roman emperors as gods, my goodness, they are like the greatest propagandists on earth. They're better than, modern dictators, practically. I mean, they put their face on every coin. They put their bust on, pillars in courtrooms. everywhere. And that's why when you go to a museum with a Greco-Roman display today, you see thousands of busts of Roman emperors, because they were there everywhere in antiquity, and they were the gods that actually received worship, and they had their own temples. So how could you not be influenced by this dominant culture? I just don't see how you would be able to avoid that.
When when someone tries to understand the historical Jesus from reading the New Testament, what advice would you give to someone that is trying to peel away the mythological material, the exaggerated material that they've used to describe Jesus?
Well, that was the most important material to early Christians. So, I mean, I don't recommend that people peel that stuff away, because the Christian myth is what Christians found interesting. I mean, today you find, different interests. Scholars, they want to emphasize the Jewish Jesus, so they want to, go to Israel and figure out, what were the Jewish presuppositions and the Jewish rituals that Jesus would do, and what was it like to be a Jew in first century Palestine. And those are all very interesting questions, but they're all modern ones. When you look into the New Testament, they're much more interested in how Jesus was opposed to the Jews rather than how he was a Jew. I mean, and this issue about worshiping Jesus as a divine Messiah, I mean, that's what interested these people. So regardless of whether you find that to be historically untrue, that's what made the Christian religion. That's what gave it its edge. That's what gave it its success. It's a book of mythology. If you were to strip away the mythology in the New Testament, I dare say there'd be nothing left. I mean, I'm well aware of, people like Thomas Jefferson, who got out the scissors and just started, cutting up the New Testament, and, just putting in the little ethical bits, saving most of the Sermon on the Mount, and making Jesus just seem like some kind of ethical teacher. But yeah, when you publish that thing, I mean, it's 10% of what the New Testament actually is. And you've basically, the Jefferson Bible it's like the good old, Enlightenment, 17th century, 18th century man's, uh, version of how to be a good person. I mean, it's not going to produce a religion, and it's not going to keep the religion going. No, I mean, the New Testament is interesting, including for me, because of all of the mythology. I mean, I lead a session at the Society of Biblical Literature called the Bible Myth and Myth Theory. So, I mean, it's the myth that interests me, uh, not people claiming to figure out what the real historical Jesus said. I mean, that's the true myth, right? I mean, we'll never figure that out. We can pretend that we figured that out. We can pretend that we've reconstructed the historical Jesus. Someone can get on your show or somebody else's show and tell us what he really believed, but that's the true myth, right? Because we'll never know, because the source from which we get information about his sayings and his thoughts is an entirely mythologized source. It's myth all the way down. You take a plunge into it, and you dive into that hole, you fall for 9 days and 9 nights, and it's still myth all the way down at the bottom. So, no, I'm not a demythologizer. I'm not a Boltmanian, and I don't think that that's a useful exercise. Is you can't demythologize the New Testament and then have it at the end be anything like the New Testament. Christians wanted Jesus to be a god because otherwise they couldn't get saved, and nothing has changed.
When Paul mentions the Eucharist in First Corinthians, do you think that's an instance there where he was being influenced by the Dionysian mysteries, or maybe something like it?
Well, I mean, I don't see why not. I mean, you'd have trouble proving that, um, because Paul's not going to, he's not going to put a footnote and make a citation there and say, "I got this from the local Dionysian theosoi." I mean, he's going to do everything he can to hide and conceal the fact that he would have any relation whatsoever with your local Bacchus. But, I mean, anyone, of course, hearing that, you drink the blood of a god would, of course, think of Bacchus, because wine was the blood of Dionysus. I mean, everybody knew that on the streets. That's why wine could serve as a libation. You tip it out at the beginning of your festivals. And the Greeks invented the symposium, and then the symposium is just a gathering where typically, rich old men get together. They lean on one elbow on their side and have a discussion while drinking wine. So, as if you read Plato's Symposium today, you see that, there was something like a sermon. They got together, they drank wine, all in honor of Dionysus. Dionysus is the host. And they try to make good on their time by telling sermons to each other. And yeah, I mean, that does kind of have a parallel with Corinth, because Paul says, you gather, you have your Eucharist, okay. Some people are getting drunk, which would happen at a symposium. He says some people aren't able to drink because they can't bring their own wine; they're too poor. Uh, Everybody, and anybody can participate by if they say, "Oh, the Spirit gave me a word," and they just stand up and they give a sermon. Uh, that's kind of how a symposium would go. So you'd have a conversation among people invited at the wine feast, and often you would listen and then interact. And I'm sure that it got rather chaotic. In fact, Paul says that it got rather chaotic in these Corinthian little wine symposiums. And instead of Jesus being the honoree, or sorry, instead of Dionysus being the honoree, it was Jesus. Everything was done in his memory, and they drank the blood of Jesus instead of Dionysus. I mean, I think that, yeah, the ancient people would immediately pick up on the parallel, even though modern people would not. They'd be completely oblivious because they've never taken a course in ancient world, and their only knowledge of Dionysus, comes from Wikipedia, or maybe they've never even heard of him. I mean, so we've, this is how Christianity has dictated the terms of the game, right? Because if you've discounted all of your opponents as old myths which no one remembers anymore, then the religion can ride free and say that it's unique. But of course, in antiquity, they weren't able to do that.
What do you think caused the earliest Christians to believe that Jesus was some kind of divine being after his crucifixion?
Well, so this gets into the meat of the book. And, I mean, historically, it was probably, first of all, these traditions of him rising from the dead. I mean, the first criterion, the first characteristic or qualification of a Greco-Roman deity is that you are deathless, and that death doesn't affect you, right? So if somebody kills you and then you come back, you've got divinity shining all over that. So this very idea of resurrection was a way of was sort of that first step into Christians rethinking Jesus not as a human but as a god. Because if he comes back in a kind of super body that can walk through walls and disappear and teleport, well, that's what Greco-Roman gods do. And then Christians sort of, they add to that, and they start rethinking the whole tradition from the bottom up, and they start coming up with traditions about how Jesus was divinely conceived in this later gospel literature from Luke and Matthew. And you also, roughly at the same time, you get other gospels, like the infancy gospel of Thomas, where Jesus appears as a child and does things, kills people and takes vengeance and can, kill people on command, make birds out of clay, and etc., etc. Outwit his teacher. I mean, it's a great book. And then Christians start thinking about, the miracles of Jesus, and the miracles start getting wilder and wilder. So it's not just that he touched and healed people, it's that he started walking on water. And, so he has kind of control over nature, which in one way, I mean, it's a way of kind of trumping Moses, right? I mean, so you've got Moses splitting the water and then Jesus walking on it. I mean, who's better, right? But, as they keep on thinking and rethinking that the miracles, one has to imagine they get better, and they as you retell the stories, they improve with the retelling. And you've got then stories of Jesus appearing in an epiphany, which are what we call, or in modern theology is called the transfiguration accounts, but it's just basically an epiphany story where Jesus appears as a typical Greco-Roman god whose body is not really made of flesh, but is made of divine light. And he can interact with other divine beings that we can't see. That's very typical of a Greco-Roman god. And then, of course, his ascension. This is what Greco-Roman gods do. It used to be that, I mean, in the very early period, the resurrection was probably equal to the ascension. Where, even in John, which is supposedly late, Jesus says right after the resurrection, I am ascending to my God and your God. And it seems to be on the same day. And then, you open the book of Acts and realize that, it's actually 40 days later, which even contradicts Luke, which, they're supposedly by the same author. And Luke says, today you'll be with me in paradise. Jesus says to the thief on the cross. Well, if it's today, then you don't have to wait 40 more days. But anyway, apart from all that, ascension is just what Greco-Roman gods do. I mean, it's what Heracles does at the end of his life. He goes up on a chariot, much like Elijah. Moses ascended. Okay. But also, Romulus ascends. Asclepius ascends. I mean, he's killed by a lightning bolt. All these people are taken up to Olympus and, officially become gods, and then they make reappearances down below on Earth whenever they want. And that's typical behavior of a Greco-Roman deity. So as the stories go on, yes, they're adding to it, and there's more and more evidence that's generated and created to prove that Jesus is a god, and he's a god in exactly the same way as any other god is a god, except, as Origen makes clear and others, Jesus is just better.
Paul Kickling, thank you for your super chat. Christ as a product of Judaic Hellenic interpolation with Indian Persian like Maitreya, Metatron, or Buddhism with Greek schools, Logos was Asha and Zoroaster.
Well, I'm not sure this is a question, and it looks like a comment to me. But, I mean, again, I would be very, very hesitant to think in simplistic terms like product. Obviously, we're talking about interaction. A product is something that you make on an assembly belt, that's kind of neat, and everybody agrees that, it's put together from such and such components and then wrapped and then sent on in a package. And there's nothing neatly packaged about Jesus, but it's indisputable that, yeah, the divine Jesus, the mythological Jesus, the Christian Jesus is a result of interaction with so many different cultural spheres. I wouldn't turn as far as Buddhism. I mean, that's pretty far east. There's not a lot of evidence for that. And there's just a little bit of dabbling with Persia. Again, what I really recommend to everyone is understand that Palestine, okay, what we think of as Israel as Palestine, is simply part of Rome. I mean, it's like it was one country with Italy at the time of the New Testament. So yes, you've got Easterners coming in all the time, but their primary people that they're interacting with and the dominant cultural forces are Hellenic, which has its focus on Greece and Western Asia Minor or Western Turkey, and Roman, which obviously has its center in Rome. And so that's where I would be looking for this dynamic cultural interaction.
Safro Briku, thank you for your super chat. Did the Eucharist start with Paul's vision, then made into a gospel narrative?
Well, great question. Paul never claims to have had a vision of Jesus handing out bread and wine, as far as I know. I mean, possibly he did, but no, I don't think that that's the case. I think Paul, yes, he did claim to have a vision of Jesus, and he claimed to go to the third heaven, and God knows what really happened. But yeah, it seems to be that what Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians 11, where he gives these traditions about the Lord's Supper, is he's just adapting for a Greek audience what Jewish Christians were doing in Palestine, which is they were having their little symposium and repeating little short phrases with regard to Jesus's last meal. And so, yeah, it's very difficult to understand where Paul came up with that material, but since he never says that he got it by direct revelation, he says that he got things by tradition, then I'm inclined to believe him. But then, what was it that Paul changed? I mean, I doubt that these little Christian symposia looked exactly similar when they were held in Corinth as when they were held in, say, Jerusalem or Antioch, because the presuppositions were different, and the people were all Gentile, and so their understanding of a symposium and of communion with God or a God would have been different when you moved it out of the dominant Jewish cultural sphere.
The Muslim apologist, thank you for your super chat. Did the historical Jesus teach that he is God?
Well, he might have. I mean, you're asking the wrong person, because as I just said, the historical Jesus is the greatest myth that one could ever imagine. I mean, first of all, there's 10,000 versions of the historical Jesus, so good luck with that. But if you don't have a time machine, yeah, you're up a river here, because again, your only access to the historical Jesus is through the Christian Gospels, which are simply variants of Christian mythology. So there you go. I mean, of course, I think Christians would like you as part of their mythology. They would like to say that yes, he taught that he was God. I mean, that's basically the whole point of the Gospel of John, right? I and the Father are one, and in the beginning was the Word, and him being able to forgive sins like the Father. That's as early as Mark. I mean, I think that in Christian mythology, they definitely want you to believe that he thought he was God. But yeah, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I mean, like a pure historian who has no faith at all, like Morton Smith, okay, thinks that Jesus was a magician and wrote a book on that. And he compared Jesus with what we find in the Greek magical papyri. And in the Greek magic papyri, you do find these magicians claiming to be God, often temporarily. You know, they come to heaven, they become God, then they come back, and they're just, themselves again. Um, so, Morton Smith, who wasn't a Christian, said that it's perfectly plausible for the historical Jesus to say that he was a God. There's nothing radical about that. I mean, I think he would say that, so did every other Tom, Dick, and Harry who claimed to perform a miracle. I mean, it's just so common that it's not even special. But yeah, I'm not going to get into debates about, what the historical Jesus actually said so that we can, claim authority based on the historical Jesus. That's mythology that I'm just not interested in.
Do you believe that the only thing that one can know about Jesus is that he was crucified and that's pretty much it?
Yep, crucified and Jewish. That's it. um, yeah, I mean, beyond that, we just we have no information. I mean, really, when you look at the non-Christian authors who talk about Jesus, that those are the two significant points that they point out and they all agree on. It's like, yep, this troublemaker from Palestine was crucified under Pilate. That's all you need to know. I mean, the rest is just riffraff and Christian mythology and a bunch of hooey as far as they were concerned. I mean, ridiculous to the point of laughter. So yeah, there's no other confirming evidence of anything in the Gospels. I mean, we don't even have confirming evidence that he was born in Nazareth, because that's only in the Gospels. We don't have confirming evidence of him, walking on water, obviously, or him, I mean, possibly. I think scholars like Ed Sanders and Paula Fredrickson, they want to say that, well, there's probably good reason to think that he had a temple tantrum, as Paula puts it, and that's what got him killed. He flipped out in the temple by literally flipping over tables and scattering the birds and really pissing the leadership off, and that's the reason why he got himself killed. Well, that's plausible, but again, there's no other source outside of the Christian Gospels which tell you even that Jesus visited the temple, although, I mean, seems perfectly plausible. But yeah, there's just no other confirmation. And when you don't have any other confirmation besides these Christian sources, I mean, is it history? I mean, it seems kind of arbitrary.
I know that you said earlier, you said a few times that you're not in the business of reconstructing the historical Jesus. However, if somebody were to ask you, what do you think is the most probable, what truth about the historical Jesus? What would you say to that?
The most probable truth about the historical Jesus?
Yes. Like, why was he? Wait, let me just rephrase it. Why do you think he probably was crucified? In other words,
Well, so we can reconstruct that, because the Romans, they don't crucify anybody and anybody, or anybody and everybody. I mean, they don't waste their time. I mean, it takes a lot of effort to crucify someone, let's be honest. It's a ghastly, bloody, awful thing. And, it's just like modern dictators do today. I mean, they just executed protesters in Iran by hanging. I mean, they're still hanging people in late 2022. What's the reason to, give someone a gruesome death? Well, it's to show the power of the state, to strike fear in the hearts of an oppressed people. And you don't do that for anybody. You do that for people whom you consider to be criminals against the state. So the charge against Jesus must have been that he was some kind of rebel against the state. So he must have done something that got the attention of Rome. It might not have been a huge thing, But if you do cause any kind of disruption at a major Roman holiday, a major Jewish holiday like Passover, which could result in mayhem, something as simple as like a stampede in the temple. Well, yes, the Romans would notice that. I mean, they have the Fortress Antonia looking over the temple. If somebody's causing a havoc in the city, they're going to be watching it. Okay, I mean, they're not stupid. The whole point of Rome is just to squeeze these people so that they pay money, pay their taxes, and then they just leave them alone. And if anyone wants to disrupt that chain of command, well, yes, they take notice. So yes, we don't know exactly what Jesus did, but he did something that raised the attention of the Roman leadership enough so that they thought he was either very annoying. Well, they definitely thought he was very annoying, but they thought that it was a threat to their imperial control of this oppressed state called Israel, or which we call Israel today.
Paul Kickling, thank you for your super chat. Do you think the Alexandrian Empire had an impact which went further east than the Romans? Hellenic sages and took Buddhism, butterfly ethics down to Philo.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the Romans were terribly jealous of Alexander the Great because he got so much farther. I mean, he got basically almost all the way to the Ganges. That's why Alexander the Great was such a hero, because he had outperformed Rome itself. The Romans, at the height of their empire, they only got to Ctesiphon, which is southern Iraq. And Trajan, in the year 117 or 116, took and sacked Ctesiphon, and then promptly lost it when the Persians struck back. So, absolutely, they went farther. Alexander went so much farther than Rome ever did. And so, absolutely, here's a place where you could think of Buddhist influence. I mean, we know that they got to India and Bactria, which is Afghanistan. So, and they talk about gymnosophists, which are the naked philosophers of India. And Alexander brings, a gymnosophist back, and he burns himself alive. And, there's a whole literature about them interacting with Eastern sages. And Rome, they don't go that far. So that's definitely, worth exploring. But that's also in the period, before Jesus. So the Greeks, after Alexander died, okay, his empire was split up into four, and the leadership that was supposed to control the way far eastern portions of it, they gradually lost those provinces. So they lost Bactria, and they lost, their Indian holdings. And so they hadn't held those for maybe, 150 years, and before Rome came onto the scene. So, yeah, we just have to keep in mind, when all this happens in order to contextualize specifically the life of Jesus.
When you look at other figures that went through, although not quite the exact same process of deification that Jesus went through, but you were even talking about this earlier about Philo's view on Moses being some kind of god or quasi god, and then in Third Enoch it talks about Enoch being Metatron. Enoch, when he was taken into heaven by God, he became the angel Metatron. Do you think these traditions also influenced the New Testament writers in conjunction with the Mediterranean traditions?
Well, I've got a whole book on people becoming angels, and that's called Post-Human Transformation. And I've put some of those kind of teaser videos on my YouTube channel, so you can check those out. I'll be trying to finish that up in the new year. So yes, absolutely. Now, Metatron is not the example I would use, because Metatron, third Enoch is quite late, probably 6th century, perhaps a bit more. So yeah, I typically, in order to do careful historical scholarship, I wouldn't really want to pick, something that's 600 years after Jesus and then say that that was formative for Christians 600 years later. I would look for evidence of people becoming angels much earlier, and I think we have that. So in Post-Human Transformation, I talk about, the way that Philo talks about Moses as an intermediate being is very similar to, how other philosophers talk about people becoming demones, and demones they're sort of like Christian angels. They're ambiguously, they can be good or bad, and Jewish and Christian angels can also be good or bad at the time. Now we've kind of binaried them off, so that you've got angels good, demons bad, but that wasn't the case in antiquity. So yeah, definitely, I would look at my chapter on Philo's Moses in Post-Human Transformation. I would look at other kind of local traditions, not only of Christians worshiping angels, but I'd go back to first Enoch, which is pre-Christian, and I'd look at traditions of Enoch becoming the son of man, or the son of the human, in chapter 70 and 71. And I'd look at second Enoch, because second Enoch, again, you're looking, this is a difficult, but you're looking at, again, probably first century text. Some people think Alexandria, some people think other places. So you've got the early traditions of people morphing into angels, and they are Jewish, and it does make sense for early Christians, most of them were Jews in the first century, to be in interaction with these specific traditions. And so you've got plenty of data there, absolutely. That's very useful to look into.
You mentioned in the book that Jesus' transfiguration throws a question mark against the mere humanity of Jesus. Could you tell us what that's about?
Well, yeah, because a normal human being doesn't have a body of light, and doesn't, when they go off to pray on a mountain somewhere, it doesn't, morph into an angelic, astral body that can talk to people who are dead. So that's not a normal human being. That's an epiphany of a divine being, who often, when you see epiphanies, the God wears the flesh, what looks like flesh, but there's an explosion of light, so that the flesh starts being translucent and photonic. So you see the real body of the God, which is often much larger, more beautiful, and better smelling than the normal human flesh. And those are the characteristic traits of an epiphany of a divine being.
Another super chat question. John D, thank you for your super chat. Could the name Barabbas, son of the father, be an allusion to son of Jacob, the father of the 12 tribes, and be related to Bar Kokhba character, star of Jacob, also described as a false messiah?
Well, it could, but you'd have to ask, I'm a historian, so I have to ask about evidence and about real historical connections. So, when we're looking at these documents, we read them all together. And yes, we look at similar sounding names and similar sounding concepts and ideas and all sorts of things. But was there any historical kind of relation as opposed to linguistic and conceptual? We have to ask, did people in antiquity make the same connection that you're making, John? I mean, so what would be the evidence of connecting to these of connecting these people? I mean, son of the father, that's pretty general. I mean, it sounds like a bit of a made-up name, to be honest. I mean, everyone is a son of a father. But usually what people think of there is that God is the father, not Jacob. But yeah, basically you could think of any father anywhere. And so it's not really a helpful connection. And then Bar Kokhba does mean son of a star. But is it specifically the star of Jacob? And are you saying that Bar Kokhba is the son of Jacob? Or, I don't know, these connections seem fairly loose to me. And Bar Kokhba was his messianic name. Bar Kokhba, which is what he was called later, son of the liar, is his name as the false Messiah. That's what, Christians like to call him. So yeah, I mean, you're raising some interesting points, but I don't see any real historical connection. Sorry.
That does get me to think of this question. I know that some scholars, some historians believe that Barabbas is actually Jesus himself and not really a separate character. They were kind of split into two characters or something like that, or that Barabbas is really a pun on Jesus himself. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, that has a little bit more plausibility because Jesus is always calling himself, or he's always referring to his Father, by which he means God, and he's the Son of God. And yeah, I mean, and the reason why I say the New Testament is myth all the way through is that the description of the trial, with Pilate, who, if you've ever read Josephus or Philo, you know that Pilate is the most ruthless, cold-hearted, cruel scumbag Rome ever produced. Would he have released a known criminal on a holiday? No. I mean, that's sort of like, I mean, you think of like President Biden, getting up there and saying, okay, we have this known 9/11 terrorist, it's, I mean, and it's like, because it's Christmas, we're going to release him. No, you just don't do that. You don't do that now, and you didn't do that in antiquity. So yes, it appears to be an entirely made-up story that can be traced actually back to Leviticus, where you have the two goats, and you let one goat go, run off a cliff or something, and yeah, the other goat is sacrificed. So Jesus is the sacrificed goat, and Barabbas is the goat that's let go. And all of this is supposed to be some kind of typology, proving that God is in control of history. But what it all ends up as is very, very poor history, and all very implausible and sort of funny in the end.
What do you think influenced the gospel writers more often? Is it the Jewish mysteries, the Old Testament, or is it more often the Mediterranean or pagan stories, or are they just both being influenced equally by both in general?
Well, this is a good sum up question, and I think that, yeah, given the time, I should. Sorry, I'm joking on this piece of chocolate. I think given the time, I should sum up here because I've unfortunately got other commitments. But my sense is that we have all been trained to think in these binary categories, right? That have been set for us. There's the Jew and the Greek, there's the pagan and the Christian. But all of these are are basically apologetic categories, like insider categories that a Christian apologist would use to distinguish themselves from the foreign other. Okay. So I refuse to use those binary categories. To me, the ancient Mediterranean world is all one world with a large dominant culture that's Hellenic and Roman. Okay. And many different subcultures, which would include, occasionally on the fringes of the empire, a Persian and Indian subculture. But much more likely, you'll have larger subcultures like a Jewish subculture and a Phrygian subculture and a North African subculture. And they're all in dynamic cultural interaction with the large Hellenic subculture. Okay. So when you go in your time machine and you ask an ancient person, are you more influenced by the pagan stuff or, your local Jewish stuff? They'd probably ask what in the heck you were talking about, because to them, it's all one big blend. And obviously, if you live in Palestine, you're going to be influenced both by the dominant Hellenic culture and your local Jewish subculture, and those elements are going to mix. And they're going to mix in your brain too. And yes, obviously, the local Jewish subculture wants to say that, Yahweh is different than Dionysius or Jupiter. But in the end, they would also agree that they shared many characteristics. Jupiter is a god of mountains. Jupiter is a god of lightning. Jupiter is a god of the sky. Those were all old traits of Yahweh as well. And so that's the world that they're living in. They say that they don't believe in Heracles and Dionysus, but when you go to do archaeology in Palestine today, well, you see, in Sepphoris and other places of Israel, they've got all these mosaics which show Heracles and Dionysus and Hermes and Orpheus. So they know who all these characters are, and they don't mind them. And so it's all one world. So I would just say that, equal influence, I guess. But really, I think we should just rephrase the question and just say, what were the dominant cultural currents in interaction with the leading subcultural currents in a particular time and a particular place in antiquity that may have affected how Christians thought about how in the world Jesus became a Mediterranean god.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Dr. Litwa.
Absolutely. Glad to be here. And thanks so much for your guests. And I should note that got a YouTube channel, got Patreon. Okay. If I am happy to take any further questions on Patreon. And I want to wish everybody a warm solstice day and a happy holidays. I know it's very dark in the Northern Hemisphere, but I can assure you that the light of King Helios shines brightly here in the Southern Hemisphere. It is the longest day of the year here. So, everyone take care.
Thank you again, Dr. Litwa.
Okay.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.